Welcome to Unit 2, which is Language Arts, Literacy, and Learning. The agenda for this lecture is going to be looking at some of the readings and taking apart, extrapolating what I thought was most important, looking at the history of literacy and the dimensions of language itself, and going into what are the language arts, and finally we'll get into homework for next week. If we take a closer look at some of the data that were extrapolated from the NCES Nations Report Card of 2011 in reading this unit, we can see that the levels of writing achievement remain stagnant from 8th through 12th grade. And I ask you, why might that be? What's more alarming are the average writing scores for students according to race or ethnicity, gender, and school location. You can see there's dramatic differences between some of each of those categories. You can see that white and Asian students have the highest scores on the standardized high school writing proficiencies test, along with females and those in suburban areas. While access and socioeconomic status may be contributors, that doesn't quite explain why the females dominate in writing achievement over males. We know that the greatest predictor of reading and writing achievement, with all other factors regressed out, is actually a mother's level of education. The expectations according to grade level standards from 8th to 12th grade begin shifting away from writing about one's experiences towards persuasive and explanatory writing. Those are the shifts in expectations throughout high school. Continuing on with statistics, certain ones pop out at me in looking at this demographic breakdown of data from writing proficiency. For me, it's the statistic that limited English proficient students actually score lower on writing proficiency than students with disabilities, and together they are statistically significantly lower than any other demographic. The need to be fluent in a language, to write well in a language, those sorts of things seem obvious, but nevertheless, all students are often expected to score highly using written language in English despite being knowledgeable and potentially fluent in their native tongue, and therefore they're unable to express themselves appropriately in English. So if we think about this, another content area such as mathematics. How can we use mathematics to provide evidential support for a descriptive essay that talks about college admissions committees and how can we describe a piece of technology that we use that's important to us, developing an essay with details that committee can further understand the value of that technology. And one way to provide evidential support is through statistics, maybe about cell phone use with certain demographics, or maybe we supply facts about the efficiency of typing as opposed to handwriting, or even we can provide a timeline of using technology in the last 30 years, for example, with computers, in which they've been more popular and as a result shifted frequencies of students using keyboards for writing instead of pen and paper. Language is a complex and dynamic system of conventional symbols. That's according to the American Speech Language Hearing Association. So if we think about other content areas like mathematics, is mathematics a language or even coding? Why or why not? I think to me, languages are all around us, and the closer we examine our surroundings, the more languages we find. Another definition of language is a socially shared code or conventional system that represents ideas through arbitrary, agreed-upon symbols and rules that govern the combination of these symbols. That makes sense to me oftentimes as the English language is not perfect. Further, contemporary views of human language hold that language evolves and that language is described by at least 5 parameters, which we're going to get into in the following slides. So language learning and use are determined by the interaction of multiple factors, and the effective use of language for communication requires a broad understanding of human interaction, such as those associated factors, such as nonverbal cues, motivation, sociocultural roles, etc. If we start with phonology, phonology refers to the study of the sound system of the spoken language, meaning the smallest units of sound that still represent something in the English language. Speakers know what sounds go together, meaning they know that words can't start with combinations in English, and what differences in sounds are important between b and p. So in the word church, for example, we have 3 distinct phonemes, ch, ch. And that's how we know there are 3 phonemes in the word church. Moving on to morphology, this examines the smallest meaningful units of words and how they're combined. So for example, in the word dogs, we know that dog has one meaning and the plural s means multiple. So dogs has 2 morphemes in that word. The morphological system governs how these morphemes are combined to form other words or larger words or even compound words. And speakers can draw on the knowledge of morphological rules when they learn new words. If we think about syntax, it refers to the structure or architecture of sentences. Oftentimes, the easy way to think about syntax is in reference to the parts of speech. So if we look in the following example, what would a linguist say about "I ain't got none"? Is this a correct form of English? Is it a dialect? Is it formal? For me, I would reference "I ain't got none" as a dialect because it's a particular form of language that's peculiar to a specific region or social group. In other words, a particular version of programming language that's understood and reflects and conveys the same meaning, even though it's written differently. So in this case, this is a really good example of a dialect. If we think about semantics, that's the study of meanings of words and the words in sentences. So if we think about this one, they were hunting dogs. We have to think about the meaning of this sentence to identify whether hunting is most likely a modifier or adjective of the word dogs. If by chance it could be a verb, too. In that instance, please sound the horns to scare the dogs away because we don't want that to happen. Finally, we're going to look at pragmatics, or the use of language in human communication as determined by the conditions of society, which is really a legalese way of trying to understand something in excessively jargon. For example, we sell our ideas all the time. Honey, can I have that? Well, it's not good for you. So just as kids know how to push buttons with their language, so do adults. And using pragmatically for particular purposes is something that we do each and every day. So as you can see, language is comprised of these 5 elements that we've just talked about, from morphology, pragmatics, phonology, semantics, and syntax. And it really entails everything across content areas in interdisciplinary ways, all as it pertains back to communication. So this is an interesting graphic that talks about the ELA Common Core standards and how the English language arts are a central point within these standards. So if we see how they are broken down according to the grade levels K through 5 and even 6 through 12, there are some similarities but also some unique features. So in the early grades, in elementary grades rather, you have reading, such as the foundational skills at the word level. You also have writing, speaking, listening, and language. And then in the upper grades, you have additional features such as what does literacy mean in history or social studies, science, and other technical subjects. Moving on to the strands, we know that the Common Core state standards and other curricula require expectations and standards to get kids or students college and career ready. And the anchor standards include those core language arts such as reading, writing, speaking and listening, and language. Note that history and social studies and science also have Common Core standards in reading and writing, strands only. So they don't require the other two, the speaking, listening, and language in history, social studies, and science. So students who are college and career ready really demonstrate several dispositions, such as independent learning, building on their content knowledge and being able to comprehend as well as critique information that comes their way. And they also value evidence and are able to provide that for their claims. And so this shift to higher level thinking skills and an increasing focus on informational passage is something that has transpired in the last 10 years or so. Also, other major shifts include the balance of literary and informational text and moving away from simply more the narrative types of text in early grades, more towards those informational books where kids can learn about content. And we've moved away from the construct of you have to learn how to read before you read to learn, but yet you can do it simultaneously, we know now. And an increased complexity of text in the different types of text and genres presented today in both print and digital formats, as well as using evidence within one's writing. Essentially, there's also an increased amount of academic vocabulary and an increasing sense of literacy within all content areas or disciplines. So the next slide talks about a balance of informational text in grades 6 through 12. And as we talked about before, in English language arts, there's literature that includes fiction, drama, poetry, and even other genres not listed here, as well as nonfiction. And so in the high school years, in middle and high school years, you have that balance between nonfiction and fiction. And then in social studies, science, and other areas, you have different kinds of informational texts, from articles to short stories to blurbs to both print and digital texts. When we think about literacy in the content areas, right, science, mathematics, those contents are taught even in K to 5 grade levels. So the emphasis on literary experiences in these grade levels really reigns supreme. And your instruction in science, history, and social studies is heavily affected by how well you know literacy pedagogies and how good of a literacy teacher are you, right? So how can somebody disseminate information in science if they can't write or they don't have, oral speaking proficiency? And then in grades 6 through 12, we talk about teaching content-specific literacy. So we start thinking about thinking and talking through the lens of a scientist or from a geologist or from a mathematician. And those sort of interdisciplinary literacies is something that's a point of focus in those grade levels. And then we move towards text-based questions and answers, where students are reliant upon different texts to really enrich their discussions, provide evidence, connect one text to another, in order to really develop an argumentative stance and an informed opinion. And these sort of habits are developed by making these arguments in conversations and rich discussions within the classroom. Another point of interest in the middle and high school areas in particular is vocabulary and having access to grade level appropriate texts. We know that sometimes texts are written with too great a text complexity, and other times it might be too low. When we think about text structures and we think about appropriately leveled text, those are definitely considerations that every teacher has to make, especially if you have students who experience difficulties in reading and writing. And we know that vocabulary is a large component of overall reading comprehension, and the ability to disseminate that information you need to have vocabulary prowess to be able to discuss your ideas effectively with others as it pertains particularly to audience-specific word use. So here's again the breakdown of what 6th through 12th grade ELA strands look like. We have the English language arts, which we've talked about, and then also separately the literacy and the content areas. And this is really a testament to the fact that every school really needs to have a specialized literacy professional, whether that be a reading specialist, literacy specialist, or a literacy coach, to be able to coach and teach these other educators to be able to successfully navigate the literacy demands today.